This is the story of Air Canada Flight 646. On the 16th of December 1997, an Air Canada CRJ-100ER was on its way from Pearson International Airport to Fredericton International Airport in New Brunswick, Canada. The plane had 42 people on board, including 2 infants. On this day, the first officer was the one flying, and he had some very bad news waiting for him. The weather at Fredericton wasn't the best. The visibility at landing would be 1/8 of a mile. This would mean that the runway would be very hard to spot, even though the lights would be set to maximum intensity. But pilots are trained to deal with situations like these, and so it shouldn't be a problem for the pilots, especially when the pilots would be making an ILS approach to runway 15 at Fredericton. When the plane was getting close to Fredericton, the pilots handed the plane off to the autopilot. As the plane cut through the thick fogs in the dark, the pilots in the cockpit were trying to peer through the fog to get a glimpse of the runway. Then, when the plane was just 300 feet off the ground, the captain started to see the glow of the runway through the fog. If this kept up, they should break through the fog at any moment, and then they would be able to land. At this point, they were just 100 feet above their decision height, and when they hit 100 feet, the captain called lights in sight, and the first officer said that he was continuing with the landing. You see, if the pilots do not have the runway in sight when they hit the decision height, then they must go around. No questions asked. Now, if you're making a Cat 3 approach, then you can basically land blind. But in this case, they were not making a Cat 3 approach. So, had they not seen the lights of the runway, then they would have had to go around. At 165 feet above the airport, the first officer disconnected the autopilot and began hand flying the plane. As the autopilot was disconnected, the plane started to drift above the glide path. The captain was concerned and started to coach the first officer a bit to get the plane back on glide. The first officer killed power to the engines in an attempt to get the plane back on the glide slope. Keep in mind, as all of this was happening, the plane was only 80 feet off the ground. It was at this point that the captain realized that the plane was too far to the left of the extended centerline, and the captain had no idea how far down the runway they were. This landing was no longer viable, and so the captain decided to call for a go-around. The first officer pushed the engines to max power and selected the go-around mode on the flight director. The first officer pitched the nose up at 10 degrees and acknowledged the go-around. Just seconds after that, the stick shaker went off. This meant one thing. The jet was very close to a stall, and the pilots did not have a whole lot of time to save the plane. They had no idea why the plane was so close to a stall. They should be climbing away and picking up speed. But that was not happening. The captain called for a go-around and flaps. A tone was played in the cockpit signifying that the stall protection system was active. But the plane was already stalling, and there was nothing that the pilots do. The plane banked sharply to the right, and then the right wing started to scrape down the runway. The plane rolled level and then hit the runway again, this time in 20 degrees of right bank. Then the plane came crashing down. As the plane dragged along the runway, the plane lost all electrical power except for the emergency lighting. Soon the plane left the runway entirely after the intersection of both runways, and it went off to the right, and then plowed through a snowbank, and then went on for another 1,000 feet, and finally came to a stop next to a hill in the snow. Thankfully, everyone on board survived, including the babies. At the end of the day, we have a landing that somehow went horribly wrong, and it was up to the TSB, or the Transport Safety Board, to find out what had happened. As soon as the investigation got underway, the weather was an immediate culprit in the accident. It was foggy, it was dark, and it was snowing, a deadly combination. Immediately, it became clear that the 100-foot cloud ceiling and the 1/8 mile visibility at Fredericton was lower than the limits permitted. But this landing would be allowed to go ahead because of the RVR, or the runway visual range. It was 1,200 feet, the bare minimum needed to perform a landing. So, by all accounts, this landing was very close to being made non-viable by the weather. This meant that the crew made the right decision in continuing the landing. They had the runway lights in sight, and the weather was on their side. Just barely. The thing is, though, Canada had looser laws when it came to approaches in bad weather than most countries. This very same approach would have been a total no-go in many other countries. This was made worse by the fact that the ILS approach at Fredericton was a Category 1 approach. This meant that the captain was not required to fly the plane, the runway did not have centerline lighting, and there was no touchdown zone lighting. The lack of centerline lighting and touchdown zone lighting probably made it harder for the first officer to keep the plane on glide and lined up with the runway. All of the things I mentioned would have helped the pilots land, but they were just not present at the airport at this time. Add to that the bad weather, and you can kind of see where this is going. On top of all of this, the first officer did not have a lot of experience flying the CRJ-100 in these conditions. And making matters worse, the procedures used by Air Canada at that time put a lot of pressure on the pilot flying. Other airlines used a technique known as PMA, or Pilot Monitored Approach. In PMA, while one pilot flies the approach on instruments, the other pilot looks out for visual cues for landing, like the runway. If the pilot looking out sees the runway, then that pilot takes over and lands, while the other pilot keeps monitoring the instruments. In this case, there is a division of labor, but in the case of Air Canada Flight 646, the first officer had to fly the plane and be on the lookout for the runway. But all of this still doesn't explain the crash. The pilots did not go ahead with the landing. They tried to go around, and go-arounds for the most part are successful. So why didn't the plane just climb away in this case? Well, the data told them something interesting. The pilots accidentally put this plane into a situation that the plane had not been in before, not even during testing. You see, the first officer pulled back power on the engines when they were very close to the ground. Now, this put the plane into an energy state where a go-around could not be carried out without contacting the ground. And then we have the flight director. The flight director is the set of bars that basically tell you how to fly the plane. It'll tell you how to pitch up and how to bank to get something done. The thing is, in the go-around mode, the flight director doesn't really take into account the speed or the configuration of the airplane, meaning that in this case, following the flight director put the plane into a pitch state that it should not have been in due to the low speed of the airplane, which caused the little speed that they had to bleed away. The first officer was probably concentrating on the flight director and so did not pay attention to the other indicators in the cockpit, saying that they were dangerously slow. In addition to all of this, ice may have played a part in this accident. Here's the thing. The weather that they were flying through was conducive to ice, but the procedures in place at that time did not necessitate the use of anti-ice systems. The use of anti-ice systems was not needed till the ice detection system detected the presence of ice on the wing. But this meant that almost 0.02 inches of ice could have accumulated on the wing as the plane flew towards Fredericton. Now, that would not have triggered the ice detection systems, but 0.02 inches of ice would be enough to lower the stalling angle of attack by about 5 degrees. In simple terms, even that amount of ice would be enough to make the plane more stallable. Now, I know that that's not a real word, but you get what I'm trying to say. Basically, the procedures in place at the time would let small amounts of ice to build up on the wings, even though that small amount of ice in conjunction with everything else we've talked about would be enough to put the plane in danger. So the investigators think that as the plane was 1,000 feet from the ground, it entered a region of icing with very small amounts of ice building up on the wing, causing the wing to lose a little bit of performance, just a very small amount. This meant that when the first officer accidentally put the plane into a low energy state for a go-around, the plane needed all the performance that it could get. But unfortunately, the very slightly iced up wing further degraded performance of the wing, meaning that the plane had no place to go but down. This crash ultimately came down to the procedures in place at the time and the relative inexperience of the first officer, and just a wee bit of ice. What do you think about that assessment? Do you agree? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.